Well, good morning, Green Valley. Who's excited to be in church today? It is so good to see you, whether you're here in service or watching online. And yeah, we started this new series last week called Made for More, where we're looking at how God has shaped us to further his plan or mission into the world. And that mission is that all people would come to know God and God's love, and how God loves humanity. And the way that we're called to do that is to be sort of an expression of God's love to the world. And Scott kicked it off last week where he was talking about how, we're not really qualified to do that. It's not that God calls us because we're qualified, but how God actually is the one that qualifies us to do this. And we have a theme, sort of statement that Scott used last week. I'll put it up on the side screens because it gives us sort of what we're talking about here. But that is that we will realize our true potential when we realize what we were made for. And the only way to realize what we were made for is through Jesus. And this is really what this series is all about, is looking at how Jesus actually, when we're called, will actually shape us and form us of what we were created to be. And we're using the disciples as sort of a template for this, or a blueprint, if you will, in terms of what it looks like for people who are essentially unqualified to answer that call and do amazing things in the world for God's mission. And now if you think about it, again, as Scott talked about last week, when you think about the disciples, calling the disciples together is probably on the surface maybe Jesus's greatest gamble, if you think about who these guys were. And, if you're looking at changing the world or saving the world and you want to put a group of people together, I think you would probably have better teams you could call to do that, right? Maybe you'd call the Avengers to do something like that to change the world, or maybe the Justice League, because they do some pretty cool stuff out there to help them do good, or even maybe the Ghostbusters, if you remember that, because, Ghostbusters. If you want to, kind of cast demons out, the Ghostbusters are the way to go for that. But when it comes to the disciples, it's none of those sort of teams. I think it's probably more like something like this, right? When it comes to the disciples. And the fact of the matter is, when it comes to not being qualified, we're all kind of like the Stooges sometimes in terms of carrying out God's plan for the world, his mission. And yet, it was through these 12 guys who were unqualified that we're standing here worshiping today. It was through this group of people that we stand here and there's 2.5 billion Christians in the world, through these seemingly unqualified disciples and the thousands of men and women that you read in scripture and in history that came after that to spread the gospel message. And that's really continues on with you and I. And as I said, that is what this series is about. And here's the thing, as we go forward in this series, and certainly today, is that the fact of the matter is, when we talk about God qualifying us, where we're qualified to go out, the truth of the matter is that calling that God has on our life starts with transforming us, the work in us, so that he can then do the work through us. In fact, I'll say it this way, is a big idea today, is that Jesus calls us first in order to transform us. And what I want to look at today is a story in the scriptures that of an encounter Jesus had when he was preaching in the Sea of Galilee that gives us a really great insight in terms of one of the big ways that God uses in this calling to transform us. And that way is a difficult way, because it's the difficulties of life that he uses to transform us. Often it's the storms of life that help to shape us in who God called us to be. And we're going to see it in this story today. And let me just set it up really quickly here. It's found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. And chapter 3 sort of started out, Jesus had been preaching in Galilee, had started his ministry. He was doing amazing things. He was doing healing people. People loved what he had to say. There was something about him as a teacher. So he had this mass following going on. The Bible says that it got so big that he started to preach towards the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and all these people were coming in. So he actually got out onto a boat out into the water and started preaching on essentially this sort of floating pulpit, because he had no more room because there were so many people crowding in. And so as people were listening to him, and he was at the end of one day of healing and teaching and preaching, this is where we pick up the story. And this is what it says at the end of the day. And this is going to be Mark 4, verses 35 through 41. But it says, that day, and Jesus is out in the boat preaching, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern sleeping on a cushion. His disciples woke him up and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Now, on the surface, we could surmise from this story very quickly, the takeaway being that Jesus calms the storms, and therefore he can calm the storms in your life. And that is very true. We could just wrap it up there and say, amen, let's go home, because I like that sort of summary, right? That Jesus can calm the storms in our lives. And that is true, but this story is so much bigger than that. And we don't want to miss this. See, friends, here's the thing, is that when Jesus calls us, he wants to take us somewhere. And that somewhere that he wants to take us is from living out of the center of who we were made to be to living in the center of it. And often the storms of our life not only prepare us for that living in who God made us to be and living out his purpose, but at times those storms can propel us in that direction as well. You know, Jesus said something very interesting at the beginning of this text in verse 35 that I think is central to this whole idea. He said, let's go over to the other side. Let's go over to the other side. And so what I want to do is I want to look at 3 areas in our life where Jesus wants to take us to the other side of, that actually helps us live out our purpose and reach what Scott talked about, our full potential and our calling from Jesus. 3 areas. And those 3 areas are that Jesus wants to call us to the other side of our familiarity. He wants to call us to the other side of our fears. And he wants to call us to the other side of our faith. So let's start with the first one. Jesus calls us to the other side of our familiarity. In other words, our comfort zone. Now, I want you to think about it for a minute here. Just kind of think of something that would make you feel or take you out of your comfort zone. How many of you would say skydiving would be out of your comfort zone? Anybody here? Yeah, I think so too. How about bungee jumping? Well, how about this? Tell me if this would keep you out of your comfort zone here. I think we should do that at youth camp this summer. Don't you think there? How many of you would say that karaoke, getting up and singing, would take you out of your comfort zone, right? I'm not uncomfortable doing that. I just make people uncomfortable when I do it. That's the reality. How about scary rides like at amusement parks? How about this? Would this take you out of your comfort zone? I'm just saying, if I was on that ride, I would be throwing up and it would be like everywhere, right? See, Jesus, just from the beginning of this, first and foremost, Jesus' call to us wants to take us out of our comfort zone. And I don't mean he wants to take us to jumping out of airplanes or singing karaoke. Jesus wants to take us out of our comfort zone when it comes to people, in terms of the people that we connect with and the people that we love. If you notice this statement, again, going back to it, that Jesus says, come on, let's go to the other side. You have to understand on the Sea of Galilee, which is actually a big lake, the other side of the Sea of Galilee is a place that is known as the Decapolis, which is a region of 10 Hellenistic cities, in other words, non-Jewish cities that were people that were very different from the Jews. This is where Jesus is taking them. And so when you think about this, this is a significant thing in this calling, because the Jews saw these people, these Greeks or Gentiles, if you will, they saw them as different. They saw them as less than. They saw them as, in some ways, like, hey, we're God's chosen people, and these people are clueless. They're kind of, we don't want to interact with them. They could not relate to them. And yet, not only in this story, but if you see the trajectory of the disciples over and over and over again, Jesus was continually taking them out of their comfort zone and the people they were going to reach and the people they were going to love, because the gospel message is for everyone. Again, this is why there's 2.5 billion Christians in the world and counting, because the gospel is for everyone. But the only way that's going to happen is if we get out of our comfort zone in reaching people that are hard to love. I'll say it this way. This call from Jesus to us, this call that wants to transform us, our transformation will only happen, friends, if we get out of our comfort zone for the people that we interact with. It's the only way it happens. See, it's easy to love people that are in our comfort zone, right? It's easy to love the people that we're friends with or that we're connected to or that we're close to or groups, and that's okay. It's easy. But what about those that are out of our comfort zone? What about those that we don't like? Or we don't like the way they live? Or we don't like the choices they make politically? Or we don't like their lifestyle, or we can't relate to them? What about people we've written stories about? Because we always write stories about people. We have a narrative of people that we don't even know. What about those people? You know, God continues to shape us and call us, and our calling of transformation, it doesn't matter how long you've been a believer, if you're not, or you just started, or you've been a believer for 30 years, God will continually take us out of our comfort zone, because our shaping and molding doesn't end until we're in heaven. I thought about this because about a little over a year ago, as many of you know, because we've been talking about it a lot, we took over this gym, Empower Fitness, where it's really an outreach to kids in our community, junior hires and high schoolers. There's 375 kids that are members of this gym. Some are believers, but many of them are not. Many of them, don't know God at all. And God had put it on my heart and has called me into this ministry to lead this ministry at Empower Fitness. And let me just say this, I could not be more out of my comfort zone when it comes to connecting with kids, because I have not had that experience. Frankly, it's a little intimidating to me when I think about these kids. I mean, I am not cool. I am not somebody that grew up as a youth pastor. I am not trying to be cool. And I'm thinking, God, really, me? You want me to connect with these kids? I mean, when I first came back into ministry years ago, when I was away from God, I joined this church and they had a volunteer opportunity to work with kids. And so I jumped into it, right? And a month into it, it was not going well. And the leaders came to me and they said, hey man, hey, we have a better place for you to serve. True story. And I said, really? Where? And they said, anywhere but where you're serving right now. I was not qualified for this. And I'll tell you, but God called me out, and God called me to the other side of the Missouri Flat overpass over here to reach these kids. And I'll tell you, sometimes there's nightmares that all 375 of them are going to be there at the same time. Yet I had another dream about a year ago. And that dream, before I knew the names of any of these kids, I had been going over there, and before I knew even their names, I saw the faces of these kids, some of these kids, I recognized them, that were far from God, that were sitting in chairs here worshiping Jesus. And I knew right then that this was God's heart, and it wasn't me gonna make all that happen, but he was calling me into that. And I can tell you this, as hard as it is, as scary as it is, and it has been, I have made some incredible connections with kids I never thought I would have ever made connections with. Is it changing them? I hope so, but you know what? It's changing me. And it all had to do of getting out of my comfort zone. You know, we talk about this a lot here, but I'll ask you the question again. Where is God calling you to the other side of your comfort zone when it comes to loving people? It could be as straightforward as, I need to start serving somewhere so God opens my heart up to other people. It could be as basic as that. Maybe God's calling you to kids, and if you do, I have a job for you, bud. Or maybe it is God's calling you to the other side of your politics, or the other side of your lifestyle, the other side of your judgment, or the other side of your unforgiveness. We know that God will continue to take us to the other side of that. I love what David Jeremiah says. He says, when God opens a door, it's often an exit from our comfort zone. Second thing is this, is that Jesus' call doesn't just take us to the other side of our familiarity, but it also takes us to the other side of our fears. Now, we all have fears. Fear is a basic human emotion. It's a normal thing. But there is a big difference between rational fear and irrational fear. You know, rational fear is healthy. Rational fear helps to protect us. It helps to direct us in life. It builds sort of how we navigate a world where there's things that we should be fearful of. Irrational fear is something completely different, because irrational fear can stop us from living. Irrational fear can stop us in our tracks. Let me give you an example. Some years ago, Barbara and I live on some property in Shingle Springs, and we have some of it is deer fenced, which is an 8-foot fence around, because deer can jump over these fences just so they don't get into some of the plants and stuff that she's planted. And so one morning, a few years back, I was looking outside, drinking my coffee, in my bedroom, looking out the window, and all of a sudden, over the back part of the fence, a mountain lion comes up and just jumps right over the fence like it was nothing, just into the yard. And I could barely spit the words out. Barb's asleep, and I'm like, God. I was actually excited because I was inside, but it was up close. And I'm just super excited. And it's like it jumps over, and it comes right by the side of our house. I run upstairs. I'm watching it come by. I took the worst video ever trying to get it. I was going to show it, but it was so bad. It was like, how did I mess? I can't take video, right? So it goes to the front of our yard, and we have a gate up front, same height, about 8 feet, and it just looked around. One little leap, one little push of the paw, and it was right out of the yard. And we were standing there, and we talked about it for a while, and then as the day went on, it dawned on me, I got to go outside at night and take the garbage out. I did, and I thought to myself, I'm never going outside in the dark again to take the garbage out. And I know that was irrational. I said, okay, I'm going to have to take the garbage out at night. I'm going to have to find a solution for that. So I did. I just get Barb to do it now, and I don't go do it. There is a difference between rational and irrational fear. So the disciples are in this situation, and they are experiencing fear. Let's go back to the story. I just want to go back to what was happening to them there. It says this furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now, this is really important to note what was going on here with the Sea of Galilee, because it had this unique sort of storm pattern. It had its own weather system. Anybody been on a boat where there's waves? Anybody get seasick here? I was born queasy. That's just how, I get queasy on like It's a Small World at Disneyland. So I read this and I get sick reading this, right? But these storms would come up, and the Sea of Galilee, like 700 feet below sea level. And then you got these mountain ranges that are like 9,000 feet above sea level. And so it created these patterns, these weather patterns where you could just be going along on a clear day and boom, storm out of the blue. And you're just overwhelmed, like, where did this storm come from? Isn't it true that it seems like the storms in life come out of nowhere? Most of the storms that we go through in our lives seem to just happen without any preparation. And the disciples are here and they're experiencing this major storm. And so this fear starts to creep in, and there's two very significant things that happen that started to exacerbate their fears. The first one is this sense of helplessness. It says that these guys are experienced fishermen. They've been on this lake before. They've gone through these storms before. And all of a sudden, they're in this situation where they're realizing, I have no control over this. It's a pretty scary place to be when you feel helpless, when you're going through something. It's a pretty scary place to be, especially people who have been in control of their lives. When you come to a place in a storm where you go, there's nothing I can do about this. I have no control over this. And yet, it's sometimes in that helplessness, in that realization that I have no control, that we could turn that over to the one who is in control. You know, the disciples, I don't believe they didn't wake Jesus up when the clouds just started to get a little gray out there. They were bailing and doing everything they could. And they're like, I'm sinking, man. We're at the end of ourselves. It's time to get God involved in this. But the second thing that exacerbated their fear was this sense of abandonment. Because they looked at Jesus as if he didn't care. What did they say to him? He said, Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing? This is the other thing about fear. It's a scary place to also be in when you think that nobody cares, that you're in something alone. And it's even more scary to be in a place where you think God doesn't care. And this is where they were. Look, man, there's nothing, I'm not saying you shouldn't feel this way. This is normal human feelings. When we experience fear like this is the point of the story is you shouldn't be fearful like this. This is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that Jesus directly responds to that fear. Look what it goes on to say. It says he gets up and he rebukes the wind. And he says to the waves, quiet, be still. Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. And then he looks at his disciples and he says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Jesus looks at him and asks him the question that's the key to everything in this story. And that is, why are you still afraid? This is the crux of it right here, because that word afraid there, it's not the word afraid of fear that we think about, just terror and fear. This word he uses for afraid means to shrink back, to be lacking courage, to be timid. What Jesus was getting here toward and what he was focusing on is, even in the midst of storms, do you have the tenacity? Do you have the courage? Do you have the boldness to continue on in mission? This is what he's asking them. I know a lot of people, some of you sitting right here in this service, in the last service, and I know I'll see them in the next service, of people that have gone through some really tough storms in their life, some really difficult things in their life, that are still living out God's mission for their life. It's an amazing thing. I think about many people in our memorial ministry have dealt with devastating loss that are part of that ministry, that are actually helping others in that ministry. I think about people who have struggled with addictions and people who have struggled with divorce and people who have struggled with financial ruin that are helping with other people who are still on mission. Do they have fears? Absolutely. Have they had doubts in the middle of that storm and been frightened and maybe considered or looked if Jesus cared? Yeah, absolutely. Because here's the thing. Jesus was not asking them, why are you so afraid? Like fear is some sort of a light switch that you turn on and off. That's not what he was getting to there. What he was saying there is, I want you to understand that when you face your fears, because they will come, there's a power out there bigger than yourself that you can deal with it. And what he's saying, it's my power. It's my power that can help you through that. This is why the Apostle Paul, he says it this way. He talks about this power against fear, and he says, God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power and love and self-discipline. I want you to hold on to that word self-discipline right here, because that's an important word in all of this. Because when it comes to fear, when you think about fear, because fear is a reality, what does it look like to have self-discipline or self-control when it comes to your fear? It's the difference between rational and irrational fear is all about self-discipline and self-control. And God says, I can give you that power when you do face your fears. Let me just give you I don't want to oversimplify it, but I'm going to. But it's like 4 areas what it looks like to have self-control when you're going through fears. The first one is to acknowledge it. It's just to say, I am struggling with this fear. See, fear, a lot of stuff comes out that at the root of it, it's fear. A lot of times anger, when somebody's angry, it's because they're fearful. There's a lot of isolation that goes on out there where people are isolated, but really underneath it all, it's fear. I don't want people to reject me. A lot of times there's this idea of negativity or sort of brokenness that happens that really at the root of it all is fear. And this story is not one, and it's important because Jesus does not look at him and go, oh, you're fearful? That's it. I'm not helping you. It's important that we actually acknowledge that we're fearful. The second one is to assess, not just to acknowledge, but to assess. And what I mean by assess is to assess what's going on in the storm to really see what's causing it. I think it's really interesting, and this is John talking here. This is not theology, but I think it's interesting that Jesus calmed that storm in 2 steps. He didn't just say, storm, you're done. He did it in 2 steps. First, he deals with the wind, and then he deals with the waves. And what that makes me think of is a lot of times with the storms, we start focusing on the things that are happening that really are just the symptoms, but not the root cause of it. So maybe you're going through a marriage and you feel like your marriage is sinking, but you haven't dealt with the winds that are causing it of anger or addiction or pride. Maybe you feel like your finances are sinking, but you really haven't dealt with the fact that the winds are what's causing it. That's the storm of not having a budget or spending or giving, sacrificing on this end. Or your broken relationships, you're sinking in those relationships, but you haven't dealt with your part in that's causing the problem in the first place. Third thing is just to ask in the storm. It's just to ask for help, whatever that looks like. See, the disciples ask a really important question to Jesus, don't you care? And the fact of the matter is Jesus does care what you're going through. And we can ask him in the midst of our storms, God, can you help me? I always think about the centurion that confronts Jesus later on, that's daughter is sick and dying, and he's doubting whether Jesus could do it. And Jesus says, all you have to do is have belief. And the man's the greatest response ever. I struggle. I want to have belief. Help me with my belief. Sometimes asking is the most important thing. Sometimes just asking for help with your friends to talk about that you're fearful, to get some perspective on it. Maybe somebody needs to remind you, God does care what you're going through. And then the last one is just to act, to take a step in the middle of it. When we can actually acknowledge our fear, assess sort of what's going on and ask for help, it allows us then to take a step. See, here's the thing. Taking steps helps us to propel us in a direction. And taking steps, courage isn't taking steps in the absence of fear. That would not be courage. It's taking steps in the midst of fear. You know, when we face the storms in life, we all have a storm theology. We do. We all have this, hey, when I face the storms, this is my theology on the storms. And we can do it. We can do a few things there. We can either move toward God or we can move away from God. The storms can actually stop us in our tracks, or it could propel us in a certain direction. The storms in our life can actually cause us to give up, or it can actually cause us to give it up to the one who's really in control. See, the point of this story isn't for Jesus to calm the storm for the disciples. The point of the story is to calm the disciples in the midst of the storm, because this isn't the only storm they're going to face. It was just the tip of the iceberg, because that's life. I thought about it. I was reading a commentary that, the disciples get through this storm with Jesus, and it says that Jesus calmed the water, that it was perfectly calm. And somebody asked the question and said, so how long did it take the disciples to realize that they were stuck out on the water because there was no wind for their sails? Jesus, hey, thanks for calming the storm, but could you bring a little bit of it back so we could get to the other side of the lake? Not too much, but just enough to get us there. See, the storms of life often prepare us and propel us to live out God's plan for our life. Last one is this, is that Jesus calls us to the other side of our faith. To the other side of our faith. At the end of the day, when it comes to living out what God calls us to do, it really comes down to one thing, and that is faith. Look what Jesus says to them when all this is said and done. He says, do you still not have any faith? See, what Jesus is saying here is the key to everything. When we think about God's calling in our life and how he actually qualifies us for that calling, the way he qualifies us is growing our faith. It's taking us from a place of little faith and growing our faith over time to a greater faith. That is how he qualifies us. There's a real curious line in verse 36 that stuck out to me in this text, where it says, leaving the crowd, behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. That the disciples took him along just as he was in the boat. Think about where the disciples were. Who was Jesus to the disciples before the storm, when they first got in the boat? It says they took him as he was. Who was he to them? Well, he was a teacher. He did some miracles. They liked what he had to say. They wanted to follow him. But you know what? They did not see him as God. They did not see him as bigger than a person at that time. They did not understand. But look what happened after the storm. It says that they were terrified when they saw him, right? They were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. That word terrified is actually translated to awe. They were in awe of this person. And the reason they were in awe is because they believed that people at that time, that there were spiritual people that could do miracles and that could say great things and were great teachers. But the only thing is that the one true God could do that nobody else could do was control the weather. And so they looked and said, this person is way bigger than a person. There's something bigger. Their faith wasn't perfected by any means, but they started, and it grew from the time before that storm till after that storm. They started to see a bigger picture here. I don't know about you, but it's easy to think about God as being a big God. I can sit here and tell you this right now. God's a big God. Or to say, I trust Jesus. I believe in everything he says. And I'll follow him to the ends of the earth. It's easy for me to stand up there and say that when the sun's shining, when everything's calm. But what about when it's not? What about when there's a storm? What about when you're frightened to the point where you can't see what your next move is going to be? What then? Can you trust in that? Is God a big God in the middle of that? This is what Jesus is trying to get to in this whole story. Because they were made for more. Is your trust and your faith in Jesus predicated on whether or not he calms your physical storm? Or do you trust him in spite of that? I want to show you a picture of this man whose name was Charles Blondin, and he was known as the Great Blondin, and he was an acrobat in the 19th century. And he did these amazing feats where he'd walk across these ropes in different places. He did it across cities, he did it across canyons, and he started to add to his act where not only did he go across it, but he started to carry rocks with him. He had a wheelbarrow and put rocks in it and would go across these things. So he got this huge following at the time. So his greatest act was, and he advertised in the summer of 1884, he said, I'm gonna walk across Niagara Falls on a rope, and I'm gonna take a wheelbarrow, and I'm gonna put a person in it and go across with a wheelbarrow. So everybody wanted to see that and thought that was the coolest thing ever. So there was thousands of people that showed up at Niagara Falls to see him do this. So he's out there, rope across it. Everybody's watching him, and he looks out to the crowd and he says, who here thinks that I can take a person across this chasm on this rope and this wheelbarrow? To the person, everybody cheered out, yes! Then he goes, who wants to get in the wheelbarrow with me? Not one person responded. You see, for somebody to get into that wheelbarrow with Blondin, it took two things. It took their complete trust in Charles Blondin, and it also took complete dependency on him. That's faith. The two sides of the coin of faith is trust and complete dependence. You see, Jesus is calling us into this boat. He's calling us to go across past our comfort zone. And yeah, we're gonna face some storms and get to the other side of those storms and get to the other side of our fears. And what that's going to take, friends, is trust and dependency on Jesus. And it's often the storms of life that actually grow that trust and dependency on him. You might be here today in the middle of a storm. That might be you. You might be fearful of something going on in your life. And if that's you, I just want to say this. Number one, Jesus cares what you're going through. He absolutely cares. Number two, he's with you. He's with you in it. Number three, that Jesus can strengthen you in the midst of your storm. He can strengthen you in it. Because number four, he has a plan for your life, and often that plan is to propel you through those storms because, friends, you got to remember, you were made for more. And there isn't any storm in this life that can keep you from that. I want to pray right now, if you wouldn't mind bowing your heads and closing your eyes. And if you're here today, I think we all need to hear these, but I just want to read you some scriptures. These are some promises that God gives us. I want you to hear these because maybe you need to hear it today. Isaiah 41:10 says this, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hand. Psalm 9:10 says this, the Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, the stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Joshua 1:9 says, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Deuteronomy 31:8 says, it is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear, do not be dismayed. 1 Peter 5:7 says, give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. And then lastly, the words of Jesus himself, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. God bless you.